I'm done presenting, and then you all can ask some questions if you have any concerns or need some ideas. Can everyone see the screen? It should say, what is magic realism? Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So we're going to talk about this idea of magic realism, which is it's a difficult term to describe, and it's really challenging because it overlaps with many other different terms. And so thinking about kind of that Venn diagram of where all these other terms overlap, which becomes magic realism. So it may be confusing, but please, if you have questions about it as you go through the process, always just email me, ask me questions. I'm more than happy to talk to any of you whenever you need to. But magic realism refers to the supernatural presented in a kind of real world setting. So, if you just took an everyday street, like photograph of a street, right? Except for all the cars were floating 4 feet off the ground. That, I think, would be magic realism because it almost seems plausible. Everything about this situation seems totally normal, except for these cars are defying gravity. So it's like these tiny little things, subtle differences that push it from a regular setting to a magical setting. But it's not surreal in which everything is crazy and it looks like an acid trip, right? So we want this to look somewhat normal, but then be like, wait a second, what is happening there? So we can think about this idea of something that's just a little too strange to believe, or something that's just a little off or super weird. Like, what happens if all the trees were purple, right? That would be a strange situation to encounter. But it also has to do with kind of the level of detail, right? We want to get all the details right so that this one thing just seems super weird. So it is often kind of confused or talked about in relationship to ideas of realism, which is an attempt to create a depiction of actual life, right? So that is an exact representation of what we see in the world, or an attempt at an exact representation. Surrealism is thinking about the imagination and psychological belief. But I think if we also think about Salvador Dali, right? Melting clocks, dripping time, stretched out people, right? It feels more like a hallucination than it does a double take of wait, what's happening over there? And then fabulism is talking about the representation of fables or myths, right? In which some things don't align with reality. So this has some aspects of all of those, but becomes its own unique thing in the fact that it's pretty real, except for there's a couple things weird. So some examples of magic realism that I wanted to show you all. Looking here, this is a highly detailed, highly rendered image. You can even see kind of the threads in the carpet, right? And the wicker chair. But then when you look at the skin and the colors being used, it feels a little off, right? This person's skin is strange colors, it's muted, their skin is very bubbly. And so there's things about this that just become slightly weird. And then also the angle that it's at, so it's kind of slightly cocked at 30 degrees. So it looks like everything's about to kind of fall off, right? And so it's highly rendered, highly detailed. Lots of this seems super realistic. And then you see these slight moments that are that really pull your eye in and are really attractive, right? Because they look so different than what we anticipate and what we expect to see. Here, this one I think kind of blurs the lines between thinking about some of the Cubist paintings, magic realism, and surrealism. So thinking about monuments, but also kind of the representations of the world. Some parts of this become more highly rendered and realistic, and other parts start to fall off the page. So I think this one's right on the line of being kind of magic realism. And then, of course, Frida Kahlo is really famous for her paintings that are also dealing with magic realism, but also heavily influenced by some of the Cubist movements and things like that at the moment. So there's often in her paintings, you'd see these very highly detailed, highly rendered images, but then there's some slightly surreal things about them, like the collapsing of, you've got Detroit over here and then Mexico over here. You've got the sun and the moon at the same time, right? So there's aspects of her work that become kind of magical in themselves, but also some really highly rendered, highly detailed, realistic representations. So some of the technology that we'll be using to create our magic realism projects one of the technologies we'll be using is this idea called image stitching, which is when you take multiple photographs that overlap. And so it's kind of like taking a panorama shot in chunks. So you would take a picture of the left side of a building, a picture of the center of the building, and then a picture of the right side of the building. And you want to make sure that each one of those images overlaps by 20% of the field. And then we can use this program in Photoshop to stitch them together. So it is always, or most always, the same location, just moving the camera from a central point. So essentially, if you had your camera on a tripod, you would just rotate the perspective of the camera, but keeping the height of the camera the same. So instead of just looking straight ahead, you would rotate the camera 20 degrees to the left and then 20 degrees to the right. And you'd get these three pictures that overlap slightly. It's the same framing, so you don't want to change anything about the camera, right? You want to keep your aperture the same, your shutter speed the same. Sometimes you might want to use a different shutter speed if different parts of the picture are going to be dark or in shadow and you want them to become brighter. It's also the same location, but just a different focal point. So you're just moving the camera, but you're not zooming in and out. So you're not changing the focal length. You're just changing the focal point of the camera. So with image stitching, as with almost everything we're doing, we want to use all the manual settings on our cameras. We want to keep the focal length, which is how far you zoom in and out, the same on our cameras. And we want to keep the ISO the same. So the ISO is often like 100, 200, 400, 800, 1200. And then we want to try to keep the aperture, which is the amount of light that the lens is letting into the camera, the same. And then ideally use the same shutter speed. Sometimes that might shift or change. And then there should be a 20 to 25% overlap between each image. So here is an image stitch that I did. And here you can see the different chunks of different photographs. So I took 4 different photos to make this image stitch together. So I took this picture up here, which had a straight line across it, right? These pictures were originally rectangles. Then I took a picture of this middle chunk, which is kind of represented here. Then I took another picture of this area here. And then I took a picture of this lower area here. And so those pictures, then I put them into Photoshop, and I was able, and I'll show you guys how to do this on Thursday, and I was able to stitch them together. And when the program stitches them together, it also accounts for kind of the shifting and the distortion of the lens, but also the rotation to give you a nice straight image. So you'll see right here that if I go back, that the image starts to bend in towards the side to make this up here super straight. And so it will also do some of that lens and image correcting for you. So you can see how I was standing in the same place and I just tilted the camera up slightly for each one of these pictures. And I used the exact same ISO, aperture, and shutter speed for all 3 of these pictures. All four of these pictures, excuse me. Focal stacking is another technique that we'll be using for some of these photographs that we'll be creating. And it's another tool that we can use in Photoshop where we'll be combining multiple images once again. But what's going to be different about this is you'll notice when you take a picture of something really close to you, everything behind it becomes blurry. But if you try to take a picture of something super far away, everything close to you will also be blurry. And so focal stacking is trying to get all the aspects of a picture in focus and really sharp in the same picture. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take multiple different pictures with different focal points, right? We're going to look and find each of those parts that becomes blurry in different pictures, and we're going to focus on that and make it really sharp, and then take multiple pictures and collapse them together. So we're going to use different focal distances, which is different than the focal length. We're not going to zoom with our cameras. We're not going to zoom in and out. We're just going to focus the lens slightly differently for each one of these shots. But we're going to use the same aperture, the same ISO, the same zoom or focal length, and the same exposure. And this will give us this amazingly super detailed, great depth of field in a picture. So the rules for focal stacking, all manual settings. Keep the focal length, the amount of zooming you have done manually with the lens, the same for all your photographs. Keep the ISO and the aperture the same. And ideally, you'll use the same shutter speed, but sometimes the things up close will have more light and the things further back will have less light. And so you might have to change the shutter speed to get a really nice picture for the background as you do in the foreground. You need to use a tripod for this or you need to make sure that the camera is steady. So holding the camera is not going to work. You've got to put the camera on either a tripod or like a stool. But if you move or wiggle the camera at all, it's really going to affect this way of taking photographs. So you cannot move the camera whatsoever. And then we'll zoom in on the live screen manually to adjust the focus for the foreground, middle ground, and background, which is different than using the lens to zoom. When we zoom in on the LCD live view in the back, what we're doing is we're just looking at the pixels. We're not actually changing the way the camera will take the picture. And we'll go over that a little bit more in detail on Thursday. So here, this is my camera, and I'm taking a focal stacking image of these woods in front of me. And what I'm doing here is I'm zooming in using, as we said here, the live screen to manually adjust the focus. So here, this is what we call the live view screen. And then every camera should have a plus and a minus button similar to this. They might be located somewhere different on your cameras. This is a Rebel T7i. And so when you do these buttons, it should have this icon here. What it does is it allows you to zoom in. So here, this is saying this is the full frame of the photograph you're taking. And then it's saying this little white square is what is showing, it's showing me on the screen. So it allows me now to sharpen, like focus in on these branches to make them appear really sharp. And then if I zoom out, it will fill this whole thing. And that's what you're actually taking a picture of. So this big white box is a diagram representing this is the whole picture. And this little rectangle here is saying this is what you see on the live view. So often, if you see this on your screen, that means that you're not looking at the entire picture that you're actually going to photograph. What you're doing is you're zooming in to be able to sharpen aspects of it. So the zooming in here is really helpful for sharpening these things without changing the focal length. And so that way you can really get a nice, good detail on your image. So aperture is super important when we're considering focal stacking. And I think this is really important for us to talk about that right here, the aperture are all these tiny little like shutters that cover the lens of the camera. The lens of the camera is actually this big outer circle, and then each time you adjust your aperture, you're actually adjusting the amount of light that you're letting touch that lens, touch that mirror, and expose the film. And so when we talk about a larger aperture, we're talking about the whole, but we're actually talking about a smaller number. When we're talking about a smaller aperture, we're talking about a bigger number. So that can get really confusing, right? Because we're talking about the amount of light, all right? So a narrower aperture lets in less light, but has a bigger number. And that's gonna be the main thing that confuses everybody, because it still sometimes confuses me. So The larger the aperture, the more light is going to get in, and the smaller the aperture, the less light is going to get into the sensor, which means the less ideal your photos are going to be. The more light that comes into the sensor, the sharper and clearer and more precise and beautiful your images are going to be. However, you're going to have a really shallow depth of field with a big aperture, and here you're going to get a really deep depth of field. So one way that you can change this or adjust for this is thinking about focal stacking. So focal stacking allows us to use a really large aperture and get a shallow depth of field. But for the first photograph, we would focus on this woman, and we would make sure that she's very sharp. And then the second photograph, we would focus on just the background and make sure that's very sharp. And then we can combine those two pictures and get a picture where everything is super sharp and gets a lot of light and a lot of detail. So that's why focal stacking becomes really helpful, is because it allows you to focus on different things in different pictures to make one really beautiful, super precise photograph. So once again, thinking about kind of what is a focal distance. And this is how we'll do focal stacking. You'll take one picture where like the bear is in focus. Then you'll take one picture where the trees are in focus. Then you'll take one picture where this background is in focus. And then you'll take one picture where like this aspect is in focus. And then we'll combine all of those. And so the only thing that you'll be changing is the focal, is the sharpness on the very end of your camera. So another thing, thinking about aperture, I just wanted to kind of show you the difference between different apertures. So I took this same picture twice, and I took it once, and the only thing that's changing here is my aperture. All right, I'm keeping the same ISO, the same focal length at 18 millimeters. And so I'm going to change the aperture, and then I'm going to adjust the shutter speed based on that aperture. So with the 4, if we go back, a 4 is pretty large, right? A 4 allows a lot of light in. So with a lot of light, I need a very quick shutter speed, which means I want to take the shutter will open and close super fast because I don't need it to be open for a long time because I've already allowed a lot of light in. All right, so I'm going to take a very fast shutter speed. This is 1/160th of a second. So very, very fast. And then the next picture is at a 22 aperture, which if we look back is very small. It's a tiny little aperture. And so it needed to be open for 1/8 of a second, which is significantly longer. And I've made this little video, which we can watch. Hopefully it will load and it will be clear, but I don't know if it's actually going to become clear. It looks super blurry on my end, so that I thought it was going to be cool, but anyways, I'm going to flip back and forth between these two pictures a couple times just to give you an idea of like what's starting to look different, and then we'll talk about that. Oh. Oh geez, I'm doing a really bad job at this. I think one of the main things that's different, when I look at this picture, we get some vignetting around the edges. So you'll notice that the corners of this image are darker than here. Do you see how clear the corners are here? And then if we look at this building right here, that building seems super clear in this photo. Oh, geez. But not here. It's very blurry. Do you see the difference in that building? And that's because a smaller aperture, an f/22, allows for a deeper depth of field, while a shorter aperture, a larger aperture of 4 is going to make it very dark back here. But we'll notice here we get some vignetting, right, where it gets dark around the corners. And so this might be an opportunity in which I would want to do some focal stacking, because this building here looks very crisp and clear. And then I could take this same picture, leaving all the settings the same, and just focus and make this building in focus instead of this building in focus. And then I take the same picture and then I can combine them to make that back building look a little bit clearer. So here I kind of zoomed in on some different sections of that same image to talk about the difference in the aperture. So this one over here is the larger f4 aperture, and here this is the f22. And you'll notice that on this chunk, this is very blurry, and this becomes a little bit crisper. It becomes a little bit more clear and easily readable. So you can see that the edges here are defined a little less than here. Here on the close-up of the building, we can see a little bit of difference, but they seem both pretty in focus. And then here, looking at kind of the larger aperture, see how crisp and clean that is, and see how kind of blurry it is here. I think it's helpful to think about your aperture and which aperture to use. When doing focal stacking, when we're doing this, the smaller apertures you can use, so f8 or lower, will be really, really helpful for focal stacking to get you a nice, really crisp, clean, beautiful image. So I want to talk to you about a focal stacking project that I did briefly that I'll be explaining in more detail how I did it for you all on Thursday. So here we can look at my layers and see that I have four photographs that here appear the same, but they're actually quite different. And this is my resulting image here. And you can see that if we were to zoom in and if this weren't a little blurry, this is in focus, this is in focus, this is in focus, and even super close up is in focus. And so that's really important to try to think about, how do I get all of these different things in focus, especially this, which is like a foot from my camera. So what I did was I took several different photographs, and you can see them here, right? So this one, we can see that this part here of the railing is not in focus. And here, it's a little less blurry, and here it's super crisp. And so these pictures have different focal lengths. This one here, this is really, really sharp and really nice and in focus. And this image here, this background way back here is very in focus and very, very sharp. And so what I'm doing is I'm combining these pictures. You can see the masks here to give me different backgrounds, right? To give me, like, here I'm saying with the white that I only want to focus on this chunk here of this image. Here with this white, I'm saying that I only want to focus on this area right here. And then this, I'm saying for this image, I want to focus on this, and this area. And then the final image is just this chunk back here. So then I'm able to mask out all the areas that are not in focus of each of these images and create one image where everything is in focus. And so the final thing that we'll be working on for our second project is a composite image, which is basically when you are taking two images and stitching them together that provide different information. So when you're putting something from another situation into one, or you're trying to omit information or add information. So I think this is one of the most famous examples of a composite image by Yves Klein. And basically what Yves Klein did was he took this picture twice. He took this picture once of him jumping out of a window onto a trampoline. So he had several friends holding a trampoline for him down here. And then he took this picture a second time without him jumping out of the window. And then he was able to stitch them together right here, so that it looks like he's leaping out of the window and going to crash into or onto the sidewalk. And so this, I'd say, is one of the most famous examples of a composite image. But it's basically taking separate sources or separate images and combining them into a single image, and to create an illusion that this is the same photograph. So when you see this, you think it's one single photograph, but it's actually made up of multiple photographs that are giving us different information. So here is an idea of a composite image, right? So when looking at this, I think I could be convinced that there was at least 6 different images. So I tried to circle what I thought were different images, right? There's going to be the image of the young lady holding the umbrella. There's probably 2 photographs of her holding the umbrella. One where she might just be holding this stick, and there's probably a light at the top because she has this nice glow on her. And then there's probably another one of her holding an umbrella with no light in it to get this right here. Then there's obviously the clouds inside of the umbrella, and you can see right here that kind of difference from the blue sky to the handle, right? Then this cloud has clearly been added, and then the background is clearly a different photograph. And so all of these have been composited together to make it look like a real singular image. The earliest known kind of conversations around composite images were created by this guy named Francis Galton, where he was working to think about the ideal human, right? And so I think so he is actually credited with the invention of eugenics. And what he was doing multiple exposures on the same photographic plate. So he was taking lots of pictures of people's faces and trying to align the eyes. So he would have my eyes here, and then he would take your picture and put the eyes of your picture right over mine. So he was making sure we were the same distance from the camera. He wasn't changing anything about the exposure time or zooming in or anything. And then he was using these to think about the ideal human, what does the perfect human look like? But he also was using this technique to investigate what does the criminal look like, and can we start to judge people's ability to become criminals based on these photographs? So the composite images were also used in terms to stereotype and exclude people from certain conversations. So here's some examples of composite images that he was doing of men convicted of larceny. And then here were photographs of people who were police officers or privates or people who were in the military. And so thinking upstanding citizens and not upstanding citizens. And could we start to think about kind of the visual characteristics that make someone a criminal or a good upstanding citizen? So the composite image also has a pretty rough history. So here, this is an image I'm working on. It's not perfect yet, but I'm taking that focal stacked image that I created where this is in focus, this is in focus, this is in focus, and these people are in focus, and I'm putting in this person here. So I took this picture of this person in a different location, and then I'm adding them to this. But here you can tell, this side looks pretty good, but here it's a little light right in here, which makes them look like they don't necessarily belong super well. And I'd say that around the feet needs a little bit of work for this person to look like they really belong. But this part here looks like he belongs. This part of the leg, less so. This part of the arm looks pretty good, but up here I think needs a little bit of work. So immediately parts of this person look like they could be here, and parts of this person look like they don't belong here, and so then through editing I can start to make them look like they really do belong in this location. So for our project 2, we'll be using all of these different techniques to create an altered landscape or an altered portrait that has to do with the ideas of magic realism. So you're expected to explore magic realism through composites and blends. So thinking about focal stacking and image stitching and composite images, taking multiple different photographs and then putting them together. And so this will be all your own individual photographs. So these must be photographs that you personally have taken during this class, And then you will composite them together. We're not using any found resources for this project. You will have to do lots of different photo shoots to get this right. You'll have to take 1,000,000 photographs. So in order to do these 3 examples of image stitching, focal stacking, and composites, I took over 400 images personally just to do these demos, and I wasn't even creating the final project, right? And so you really need to take lots and lots and lots of photographs if you're gonna get a great result. So you want to think about overlaps between reality and the surreal. Your technical goal will be seamless blends, selections, and composites. So my technical goal with this image is that you can't tell that this is 4 different photographs combined together. And right now, I can see like one spot right about here where my image starts to get a little blurry. Other than that, to me, this seems pretty seamless in terms of how it looks, right? And then I'd say that this person doesn't yet look like he really belongs in the photograph, that he needs a little bit of work around the shoulders, like we said, and around this calf and the feet to look like he really belongs there. And so this is not a seamless composition, right? This is not a seamless blend, selection, and composite. Because it doesn't yet confuse you as to whether or not this was actually 1 photograph or 5. The project will involve the documentation of a location and the addition of elements that challenge and subvert the logic of a single frame. So right now, this one's not challenging or subverting any logic. Like, this seems like a totally reasonable composition. But if we look back at this one, right, this is not a realistic scenario, right, where there would be a little cloud floating under her umbrella with her, and you would see this beautiful sky underneath her, and her hair is clearly dry. This is probably not necessarily a realistic photograph. This is subverting the logic of what we think should happen, right? So we need to look at this and be like, is it possible for that to actually exist in a single photograph? And then be able to so you need to use these skills of stitching and selections and blends and composites to create something that could not possibly happen in 1 single photograph. So we'll be working through Lightroom to think about a good workflow from the camera to Photoshop, and we'll also be learning some new tools. So for this project, you're going to write an extended artist statement. This time you're going to write 3 paragraphs instead of 1 paragraph, and we'll be talking more about that. You'll be talking about your intent, your influences, and your methods. You will create 1 altered landscape portrait high-resolution image that should be 12 by 18 or 18 by 12, and should be 300 DPI. You will also write a formal 3-page written review, and we'll be talking about that as we get further into the project, about exactly what that will look like. So those are the 3 outcomes that we'll have. This project, it's quite quick, just like the other one, but we'll have a little bit more time, and we will be doing some demos on Thursday, and then the following week, on the 26th, we'll meet and we'll have some individual progress discussions, and then we'll have an in-progress review, similarly as we did yesterday for this project on the 28th, and then we'll review each other's artist statements on the 1st, and then your projects will be due on the 2nd, and then your peer reviews will be written by the 4th. So it's, all of these projects, we're really just chugging through them, moving quite fast. Things to consider as we move forward, and this is the thing that I think I stated to a lot of you in my kind of email feedback of your in-progress project. The more images and masks, the better. The more complex these projects are, the more layers you have, the more interesting they're going to be. The concept really needs to come through. When we look at this, we need to be able to tell exactly what the story is that you're building. I'm really thinking about how does the arrangement reinforce the concept? Do the images that you're showing us tell us the same story that your artist statement is telling us? We need to really make sure that our masks are super perfect and refined. Like I would say, this is probably like a B plus, right? Because he still doesn't look like he belongs here, and it takes a long time to make them look like they really belong in this place. So this is a B plus in terms of craft. We're not cutting and pasting anything. We're only using masks, which we learned about for the first project. So we're only using reversible processes, which we'll talk more about on Thursday. And the more complex and the more images you use, you'll create more layers and also like more deeper, interesting, like conceptual, critical, metaphorical layers.